Um, so hello, thank you for having me. Thanks to Tim and David and Kevin and Michelle for organizing this. Thanks to Rachel for all of her help too. Um, the work I'm going to share this morning is part of my book that's going to come out in the fall. It's called Throw Yourself Away, Writing and Masochism. I'm showing you the cover because I just got it like this week, so I'm excited. But this cover is a photograph of the American actress Elizabeth Robbins playing Hedda Gabler in London in the 1890s. And in this famous scene from that play, Hedda is burning the only copy of a manuscript written by her former suitor, Lufborg, who is Oslo's most promising writer. Once she has burned his book, it will be easy enough to drive him to suicide, is what she thinks. And her attempt to shape the plot of the play, her own authorial fantasy, proceeds by way of her investment in a masculine figure of authorship whom she installs as the tragic hero of her fantasy. This dramaturgy of gender is something that Hedda has in common with certain other feminine figures that I examine in this book. It also anticipates Freud's famous account of women's masochism, which relies on what he calls sadistic form, whereas male masochists appear as the victims in their own fantasies of being beaten, Freud says. Women with these fantasies invariably appear or disappear outside of them. So one of the main concerns of my book is to trace the ways that writing can function as an erotic system for displacing or erasing the self, for example, in the work of Henry James, or quite differently of Adrienne Kennedy. And the question that these texts answer is less why me than why not me, which was going to be my joke, but then I saw that it's actually the title of Robin's talk this afternoon. But anyway, the central importance of theater in many of these texts, which the things I read are not only plays, but also stories and essays. The way that theater turns out to be important for the convergence of masochism and writing turns out to be different from what I think is a really familiar idea that masochism is theatrical, meaning is like stagey. And that idea you kind of find everywhere, and especially in the orbit of men's masochism. So in Freud, in Deleuze, in Reich, David Savrin, and even in Leo Bersani's casual remark that S&M is, quote, a kind of melodramatic version of the way sexuality is always working anyway. In the things that I look at, masochism does press the subject with particular force towards expression as a desire that always wants to put itself into words. But if the masochistic dramaturgies that I've encountered provide for self-display, they also press even more insistently towards self-displacement and self-erasure. After all, theater isn't only a place for viewing and being viewed, it's also a place for disappearing into darkness and for delegating pleasure to others. And perhaps more profoundly than either of these, it's a place where the authorial or compositional imagination is exposed to the unpredictable, contingent violence of the world's response. This is why Hedda's authorial fantasy, like most masochistic fantasy that interests me, necessarily comes to grief. And this is also, I think, where Autotheory comes in. And I should say that my own kind of definitional and historical understanding of Autotheory really relies on Lauren Fournier's book. So exciting to have her here today. Quote that I find helpful, just in case Autotheory isn't a super familiar concept for anyone who's sitting here. is that the term, this is Lauren, quote, refers to the integration of theory and philosophy with autobiography, the body, and other so-called personal and explicitly subjective modes. Okay. So in the chapter that I'm going to talk from towards, I read Paul Preciado's Testo Yonki, and then Eve Sedgwick's A Poem is Being Written, which is what I'm going to focus on today. And then I also talk about a story by Gary Fisher. And basically, I'm trying to argue that autotheory enacts a masochistic dialectic. And here is what that is. In one movement, the particular self is written into the text, right? Here I am, in order to be overwritten by a theoretical register with which the writer will also attempt sadistically to identify. And then in another movement, the writing self establishes itself and its work, including this work of self-abstraction, in a perpetual relation to an outside that always has the power to hurt it, the writing self, worse than its own abstractions can. So it might be tempting to call this dialectic sadomasochistic because it has both things. And yet this term, with its promise of symmetry, seems to me to elide the incommensurability that I think is fundamental to that second movement of desire as it operates in these texts. In other words, the irreducible difference from masochistic fantasy that a violently contingent exteriority can always bring to bear. Sedgwick's work in particular shows the writerly resourcefulness of masochistic fantasy can be deployed not only to manage the precariousness of desire, but also to exacerbate it, repeatedly invoking an excess beyond what the work can compose. And obviously writing in any genre can enact this or does enact this, but I want to argue for the special aptness of the genre that we now call autotheory for staging this perverse venture. Eve Sedgwick's 1987 essay, A Poem is Being Written, which was then republished in Tendencies in 1993, her essay predates the use of the term autotheory, but it's a stunning example of a writer doing theory by way of the explicitly personal and the confessional. And Sedgwick does this in a way that explicitly claims that mode of writing for masochism. I'm just going to really briefly try to summarize this essay, which is impossible, but here we go. So the essay, one thing it does, I used colors. One thing it does is it offers an account of Sedgwick's own development as a poet, specifically as that development is attached to and formed by her experiences and her fantasies of spanking in childhood and later. The essay also reprints poems from her life, from different stages, her own poems, and kind of theorizes her own erotic investments in writing them. And then the thing that I guess is most important for this talk is that the essay is divided into two sections, which correspond to two ways that you can think about spanking. So the first one is called Spanking and Poetry, and it is thinking about spanking / writing as sadomasochistic. That's a term she does use. And then the second section is called Fundamental Misrecognitions. You get it? And it's a shift into thinking about spanking instead of in terms of sadomasochism, now in terms of anality, anal sexuality. So what I want to say is that Sedgwick's way of engaging with masochism in the essay itself demonstrates a masochistic literary procedure, which is obviously not surprising. But what is maybe sort of surprising, I think, is that the masochism that the essay enacts, I think, is more complex and capacious than the version of masochism that Sedgwick characterizes in the essay. And that discrepancy is what interests me here. So how does Sedgwick talk about masochism? In the first section of the essay, she describes her childhood writing as an erotic practice through which she rehearsed and mastered the experience of being spanked. Not by writing about spanking, which would come later, but by discovering that poetry itself could provide the same structure of pleasure as spanking, while at last giving young Eve the upper hand. Here's a passage from the essay in which she elaborates this analogy between spanking and poetry. So she says, "The lyric poem was both the spanked body, my own body, or another one like it for me to watch or punish, and at the same time, the very spanking, the rhythmic hand, whether hard or subtle, of authority itself. What child wouldn't be ravenous for dominion in this place? Among the powers to be won was the power to brazen, to conceal, to savage, to adorn, or to abstract the body of one's own humiliation, or perhaps most wonderful, to identify with it, creating with painful love and care, but in a temporality miraculously compressed by the elegancies of language, the distance across which this body, in punishment, could be endowed with an aura of meaning and attraction, across which, in short, the compelled body could be chosen." I wanted to put this passage in front of us, partly just to remind us of the kind of remarkable qualities of the essay's prose, which I'll come back to later, but also to begin to see how, in spite of how, elaborately, lovingly Sedgwick is treating masochism here, she's also consistently associating it with a tendency to abstracting, compressing, simplifying. So she uses the word elegancies here, and elegance is not a Sedgwickian value. In fact, it's a term she uses elsewhere in Tendencies to criticize psychoanalytic criticism. She refers to its irreducible theoretical elegance. It's often been observed that her own critical sensibility unceasingly favors complexity, asymmetry, plurality, as in her very famous proposal that the word queer could refer to, quote, an open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning. From the person theorizing a queer poetics and ethics of excess, masochism is figured as a reductive relation to the sexual field. And quite explicitly. So, for instance, in the first section of the essay, Spanking and Poetry, Sedgwick writes at a certain point, and she's about to kind of make a chronological jump in her narrative. She says, "Let me jump ahead here for a moment along the simplest of the trajectories to hand, the directly sadomasochistic one, whose perversion lies in its retardataire simplicity." At the end of this section, she announces that she's about to retreat from that simplified trajectory, in other words, the story of masochism or sadomasochism. And then at the start of the second section, which, remember, shifts its focus from masochism to anality, Sedgwick refers to this new section as, quote, "the second part of my story, a more tortuously inclusive trajectory, which, quote, cannot be read as directly as the first." So the second trajectory, marked off as counter to the initial masochistic one that she rehearses. The second one is where Sedgwick discovers female anality, which the essay presents, and this is key, as the destabilizing underside of the first section's masochistic spanking scenario. So anality is the complexifying addendum that masochism and its analytic would prefer to exclude. Okay, in what sense is anality more complex than masochism for Sedgwick? And in what sense is its trajectory or its kind of developmental story, quote, more tortuously inclusive? The title, Fundamental Misrecognitions, is of course a joking reference to the ass, but The joke also emphasizes that we're turning to something deeper than the first section's focus on masochism, something that is not so evident on the discursive surface of things. The profundity we discover, it seems to me, is twofold. So first, it's that of the full body, no longer compressed by elegancies, as in the first passage, no longer abstracted, but sounded in its depths, like all the way to the bottom. But the shift to anality is also more inclusive in that it brings in the social in this essay. So anality is the thing that makes it possible or necessary to think about systems that structure the subject at a deeper than phenomenal, let's say, level. And this is because erotic or critical attention to the ass entails a kind of localizing focus that cuts against abstraction and makes you attend to your ass as an ass in particular. So, whereas masochism, with its always figural child body, promotes an abstractive aura of meaning, right? It's just a child that's being beaten. The ass is never just an ass. It comes with predicates. Among these, Sedgwick acknowledges predicates of race and class, but the one she focuses on is gender. So Sedgwick's ass is a female ass. And so in the essay, anality ushers in a kind of unavoidable relation to sexual difference, ushers it into the essay, but also into her own psychic development. Both Eve and the essay now have to deal with what she calls a gender dimorphism of discourse that is almost unthinkably extreme. And what that is, then, this is the thing she claims, is that the discovery that whereas anal eroticism in men is incredibly culturally significant, which is something we know Sedgwick thinks from her other work, because anal eroticism in men signifies homosexuality, which signifies everything. There is no, she writes, no discourse in which women's anal eroticism means anything. Thrust into the domain of what she calls the gendered and sexed adult, Eve finds she must grapple with a cultural system that shoves the female ass down into obscurity while raising up the male. Correspondingly, she becomes a woman whose attachment to anal eroticism leads her to identify sexually as, while also having learned that she is not a gay man, which is why it's called fundamental misrecognitions. So the simplifying elegance of sadomasochism gets queered by the rich complications of anality. And yet, Sedgwick also makes it clear that her masochism persists through this shift. She calls it a surviving childish armory. She calls it a stubborn siege. She makes it clear, though, that whatever it is, it still structures her writing. This is a passage where she says that. She writes, "A trick of discursive authority became my utterance in prose as in poetry. The main component of this authority seems to me to be the presentation of a piece of writing as the now under control," so she's talking about her own writing, right? "As the now under control palimpsest of some earlier plurivocal drama or struggle among tones, among dictions, among genres. The visible marks of solicitous care and of self-repression, the scrupulously almost not legible map of exorbitance half erased by discipline, the very careful, one might add, very pleasurable orchestration of spontaneity and pageantry, the same with which one's parents took one over their lap." So masochistic fantasy is still active and is even structuring this essay, is what this passage is telling us. So the thing that's in quotes is something that is a quote from the essay itself, right? The essay is marking that it is an example of this palimpsestic masochistic procedure. So if the essay is still being structured by masochistic fantasy right now, why does Sedgwick also keep positioning masochism as this kind of too simple fantasy that the recognition of anality rushes in to disrupt, to overthrow? Okay, so I think that the answer to this actually lies in the reference to theater that we see is ineliminable in the way that Sedgwick describes her own writing. So in this passage, plurivocal drama, orchestration of spontaneity and pageantry, these are definitely references to theater. That's what these things mean. Theater here is not so much a form in particular as it is form itself, the subjection of material multiplicity to determining aesthetic arrangement. As such, theater is also both a display of power, like, look what I can do with all this stuff. And it's also the performative constitution of that power. But I suggested earlier that the masochistic investment in theater also relies on the proximity of what the form can't contain. And this kind of desire specifically invites a distressing invasion of its own fantasy. It needs there to be something else besides its own imagination, whose advent is desired, but will happen as if unpredictable and alien. Theater may figure, as it does in this passage, parental and authorial control, but it also produces the ongoing sense that what is now under control, as she puts it, will burgeon forth disruptively and unpredictably again. And it seems to me that a poem is being written, Sedgwick's essay, stages the upsetting corporeal and social reality of the gendered ass in just this way. In structuring her argument the way she does, Sedgwick reveals masochism's own structural imperative that there be something else in the offing, something masochistic desire itself cannot contain. So this exteriority is the position Sedgwick assigns to the female ass, which is then able to embody the violent disruption or excess meant to bum rush masochistic fantasy. She writes, that when she's writing about herself as a child, she writes, I planned for each poem in a booklet I made at 8 to be closely framed by a golden proscenium hung with curtains. And yet, the theatrical frame that Eve chooses for the young Eve, little Eve, the theatrical frame she literally wants to put around the inviolate space of the poem only marks the poem's susceptibility to violation. The proscenium is a frame that could have no reference, no meaning, no function without the obtrusive presence of the very heterogeneity it always might fail to exclude. To put a proscenium frame around the poem is precisely to expose the breathlessness with which the masochist lives the gesture of aesthetic autonomy. Such insistence on marking off text from context makes it impossible not to notice the reality that still accosts the work. The very gratuitousness of the frame around the lyric poem, the poem which, as Sedgwick helps us imagine, as we saw in that first passage, is itself already a vigorous act of framing, suggests that what the masochistic child wants with the poem is not simply a purified space of artistic control, but the promise of a confrontation with whatever is alien to that space, even what is devastating to it. And again, in this essay, Sedgwick constructs her own ass as that thing. Can you believe how many times I'm saying that word? It's wild. Okay. Of course, in the essay, Sedgwick does manage to master anality's intrusion, to incorporate it into her composition, exercising the discipline she describes, perpetually topping herself, which would be one way to characterize the opportunity of auto-theory. But there's also something in this mode of writing that resists the elegance of the simple switch. An invitation, let's say, to a mode of force that can't come from the subject herself. An openness towards whatever might be unassimilable to her powers of composition. This gesture of invitation can appear as a kind of excess or remainder in the fabric of the writing, something that sticks out, begging to be punished, a slight mismatch between what the writer is invoking and what she has been able to compose. I think we see this kind of invitation in various places. For example, the essay repeatedly addresses a you who it imagines pointing out flaws in its argument. She writes, "I do see, however, as I know you do." Sedgwick's you in this essay is never explicitly named, and this means that it might actually be you. It might be anyone, it might even be me. I think Sedgwick's you is best understood as a theatrical address to an invisible audience, and Kyle, you might agree, a performance whose erotics center on the wild fact that the audience response to one's authorial pageantry, I don't know, the audience's response to it, that is to say, your response, could be anything. That in the darkened surround of the auditorium, it could come from anywhere, including, of course, from the wings or from behind. I think this desire also shows up in Sedgwick's systematically expansive footnotes, which enact an almost frenzied awareness of how vulnerable the text must be to critical intervention. And I also think you see it in the elaborateness of her prose syntax, which has rightly been likened to that of Henry James. Ramsey Fawaz observes that Sedgwick's writing stylistically models human multiplicity, even as it is always inviting a counter response, a particular other claim. Addressing a virtual multitude in order to produce an alien, unpredictable response to her own expression of desire, Sedgwick striving to, quote, orchestrate or contain more and more differences, even within a single sentence, is not just, as she self-deprecatingly suggests, a performance of her own sadomastery, but is also a way of building into the text a kind of thrilled receptivity to all the vectors of challenge that might surge up to meet her argument. Always looking out for more of them, the text enacts her appetite for the potentially painful ungovernability of the corporeal and social arenas in which her discourse might happen. For Sedgwick's writing to function erotically in this way, as masochistic theater, in other words, it needs to be able to take this kind of punishment, bring it into the text the way she does with female anality, and at the same time, it also needs to set itself up for further dangers that it doesn't incorporate or master, and whose threatening presence can remain just outside the frame. So Sedgwick's ass is the version of exteriority that is being mastered in the essay, brought conceptually and compositionally under control. Its disruption of a masochistic simplicity has, of course, been orchestrated by the masochistic essay itself. By enacting the erotics of this structure, however, the essay also cues us to look out for whatever the next iteration of this disruption might be, something that the essay has not mastered, but that casts a kind of shadow over the work. And one category of this would be a text's ways of laying itself open to critique. And I think that this does offer a way to think about Sedgwick's work in relation to Grace Lavery's critique of that work as egg theory. I also think that it can speak to Sedgwick's work with Gary Fisher, and I'm happy to talk about either of those if that's of interest later. But more broadly, Sedgwick's writing works to sexualize the frame that marks off the text from the life that has produced and now receives it, making the relevance of anything that was, is, or could have been going on around the work an erotically loaded question. It's from within this charged relation to context that for the past decade, reading Sedgwick has meant, reading Sedgwick has meant encountering as the ultimate instance of what her texts couldn't handle, the unmasterable fact of her death. Is it absurd to suggest that the fact of Sedgwick's death itself belongs to the masochism of this essay, precisely by being that which its writing can't describe, manage, or contain? The earliest poem of her own that Sedgwick reproduces in the essay is called Cheerily, she says, Stillborn Child. and it images the child's body in and as romanticized death, with eyes that see nothing, void of expression. How could the crumpled face of the dead child in the poem not be the crumpled face of little Eve or her sibling mid-spanking, arrested in the image of a death that is, let's acknowledge, always also on the table when an adult is beating a child? So that while the entire text of a poem is being written, theorizes, demonstrates, and invites us to the erotics of a lifetime of writing, a sexual trajectory as a literary career, it also installs at the heart of this career the figure of the writer as an asexual, asocial, barely corporeal corpse, as a child, as in Freud's famous title, A Child is Being Beaten. And precisely by installing this figure of death in the essay as fantasy, Sedgwick arranges for or orchestrates the awful non-coincidence of that fantasy with the actual inevitable event, which is that a particular grown woman lies dead where the perfectly abstract neutrality of a child was supposed to be. Sedgwick's actual death belongs to the masochistic structure of her essay by virtue of the fact that it cannot belong there. And yet it does belong in this talk, the one I'm giving now. Just as Sedgwick's ass is part of the composition of a poem is being written, the devastating fact of Sedgwick's death has become fundamental to the sex act of elaborating on her text. Equally fundamental, however, is the way my own writing that loves and wants to imitate Sedgwick's, will also reiterate the masochistic gesture of beckoning the unbearable again by opening onto something really unbearable for the writer, something this writing cannot manage. In the case of my talk, this further something would have to be far less assimilable to the present composition than the death of a writer whom I love but never knew. I have some ideas of what that devastating something might be, but of course, I'll leave that to you. Thank you.